Welcome! It's our first broadcast of London Fashion Week, and what a show to start with. It's the Fashionista show, and I'm joined with Head of LCF, the wonderful Frances Corner. We also have Director of the Centre for Sustainable Fashion and a fashion designer as well, Dilys Williams, and writer, journalist, hack, Marion Hume at the end. How are you all doing? How are you enjoying London Fashion Week so far?
I'm kind of amazed by this environment that we have coffee and cake, and this is fashion. This is an amazing start.
We've just won you over from the start.
Absolutely. Show me a beautiful teapot. That's all we need.
It's very exciting to see the diversity already. I mean, I'm very excited to see what's going to come up this morning, and putting three very different designers together and showing them. I think it's going to be lots of fun.
It's kind of a symbol for London, though, putting lots of different designers together, isn't it? That's kind of what London's been known for. It's just this kind of massive excitement and energy. And do you think London is the city at the moment that people are secretly, whether they admit it or not, the most excited about?
I think one of the things that's also really interesting is the relationship I think that London Fashion Week has with the great sort of art colleges that are here in the UK, where so many people will come internationally to come and study here and really be part of that mix. And I think what's really exciting is that relationship and how people are really keen to know where these young designers come from, what's their history, and that sort of bubbles up. So that's the great thing for me about London, is a sort of bubbling up that you get of talent, not just the sort of idea of the brand.
Yeah. If you look at that with Fashionista alone, we were saying before the broadcast starts, but the pedigree of designers that have come through that, so like Gareth Pugh, Jonathan Saunders, Richard Nicole, Marion Hume, and you can see this kind of the real channels, as you said, from the colleges right through to London. That's not really replicated in any other cities, in my opinion. Would you say that's the same?
And as Frances said, I think speaking to graduates who come through the fashion system in different parts of the world, what they say about education in London is that it really celebrates the identity and the nurturing of the person. And the collections that they produce are a manifestation of that identity and that personality, not driven by this idea of fashion and starting with fashion and then going back to the person. It's the person expressing themselves. So it's a really expressive way of learning, and I think that comes through in the work.
The question really would be, if you were a young student, why would you go anywhere else? Although you could go to fashion schools in Paris, and perhaps you could learn to tailor an immaculate straight line, you can do that and combine with this. I mean, if one was 18 from anywhere in the world, that's the wonderful thing about London, isn't it? That it isn't really about those of us that are Londoners. It's about everyone coming here and studying in a really creative way, and then moving on to Fashionista, and then moving on. And as you said, Jonathan Saunders, you get to that level if that's where you want to go.
Yeah. I think the other thing is also London has this tolerance of what is fashion or what's possible. As you say, there isn't a sort of prescriptive, even if you think about, I don't know, if you think about Paris or New York, there is an idea of something which is much more influenced, not exactly by the mainstream, that's the wrong way of describing it, but there's a much more of a sort of strong aesthetic or a strong approach to what's produced, whereas in London it can be anything. It can be all of these ideas, or it could be something completely new and original. And I think that's that idea of the tolerance and that openness to so many different points of view is, I think, one of the things that's great. And I was on a discussion in Milan sort of 6 months ago, and they were talking about the fact that one of the problems is that Milan's great, yes, but it's sort of being held by these designers who are there. They're going to, they're not going to give up their spot. Whereas the great thing about London is that you've got this idea of new ideas coming up, and somehow it's accommodated. So you've got, Fashionista, or you've got, Vauxhall Fashion Scout, or you've got, a whole range of other opportunities and alternative showcases, which is really, there isn't a hierarchy.
No, it doesn't have any space whatsoever. Also, I think in London there's this idea of being able to see things in unusual places and in sort of everyday objects, whereas I think in some of the other fashion capitals it really is about that sort of luxury, that top 1% that we were talking about, and that just narrows your myopic focus, and I think here there's much more understanding of seeing beauty in everyday life.
I think what's wonderful though is that most of us have been covering London Fashion Week for a very long time, and we used to complain, and I think legitimately, that it was all just the kind of exciting stuff, and there wasn't then the very solid business structure And that has been the most radical change, that you see people coming from Fashion East and not then just, having fun for a few seasons and then going spectacularly out of business, which used to be the arc. They can now build very significant businesses. And Lou, you were saying before, the difference we're about to see these three young designers who are coming in a way in the footsteps of the like of Jonathan Saunders, who has built a business on kind of immaculate and beautiful clothes, and Gareth Pugh, about whom you would say very different things, very exciting things. So they can go in many directions, but actually build real businesses, which to me is very exciting.
I think one of the other things, because we have a Centre for Fashion and Enterprise in the college, which helps to support. I mean, we talk about Richard Nicol, Mary Schwab. So there's a sort of relationship between Fashion East, New Gen, Centre for Fashion Enterprise, which has begun to plug that gap between and to help prevent designers, in a way sort of exploding, and the sort of push and the difficulty of getting funding, but also how you then, if you get the funding, how you manage it. Because there's one thing having the money, there's another thing actually being able to grow the business in a sustainable way. And I think we've certainly within the centre have learned a huge amount about the relationship within, obviously within getting the right sort of production element, the sort of PR, the fact that you've got to manage your cash flow, some really sort of simple, basic things which need to underpin your business, and that also as you grow it every step, so those challenges become more complex and need to be rethought, and you need to have a range of different sort of mentors and relationship with industry. And I think that's been one of the great things that's happened in London, and people, things like Fashion Fringe and the work that Colin McDowell has done, it's all identified the fact that there has been this gap, and that it is awful really on the one hand to then create this great sort of aspiration and desire amongst young designers, not to then support them and help them grow sustainable businesses.
And I think now also it's going forward to looking at production, because I think a lot of the designers are they got a little bit bigger, and then they had to go to Italy, they had to go somewhere else, and then it all got too tricky and difficult. And now there's much more of an ability and a resource for being able to continue in the UK, and new business models. People like Christopher Rayburn, who we work with, has found a new way to be a designer and a maker, and realise that by being a maker and a designer, it means that his designs can really have a strong identity, and he doesn't then have to subsume to a particular factory doing something in a particular way. He's controlling that himself, and it's tricky. It's really tricky. Doing production is, hard work, and being able to keep a factory going. But these new ways of looking at particular materials, sources, and resources, and reusing things, they've had to open their own factories because nobody else was already doing it. So I think there's new business models coming through as well, and these guys are seeing it all the way through, and also thinking about who's wearing their clothes. Certainly with the work that we do at Centre for Sustainable Fashion, we've worked with a number of London designers who are just thinking really differently about the experience of wearing clothes and what that means as a designer, different kinds of resources, of materials that either are coming from different streams rather than just going straight to, again, European mills that have big minimums. I think something that identifies UK designers is that they're really resourceful, and on the level of not wanting to waste things, but also thinking about how they can use the things that they've got, and I think that comes through as part of our sort of DNA.
I think the other thing that's also exciting about London, and that you can see with some of the designers already that are going to be, looking at Claire Barrow, and obviously she's done the relationship with Joseph and so on. So quite early on, the idea that you can be a designer with a really great outlook, and that other people want to understand that and collaborate. So it's beyond just always the idea of the capsule collection, but because we certainly help support and partner up, just like thinking about Christopher Rayburn with the Swiss Army, Victorinox, or you've got other designers partnered up with Kipling bags or things like that. The idea that it's also to do with your creativity and ideas, which other companies want to get a bit of, and then that again helps to grow and sustain their sort of own developing label. And I think also gives them another understanding about business and how to make your USP in a way relevant to other parts of other industries.
I think with something like Topshop, you can see it with their sponsorship, but they've kind of encouraged that collaborative aspect, which is so sort of key to what London's identity is. If you look at someone like Martin van der Horst, he's already done a range for Topshop. That's almost unthinkable somewhere else. Such a young designer, sort of a couple of years out of college, and his clothes are affordable and being worn by people and getting them to buy into his brand and be excited by his brand. And I think that's something that does kind of bring that excitement to London. But I think it's also something that gets forgotten a bit about Fashion East. I think so much of the attention is on the shows because they're so exciting and so fun that you almost forget that so much of Lulu Kennedy and the whole team's work there is about that sort of teaching them to build their brand, teaching them to budget, taking them off to Paris for the showrooms, finding them clients. And it's kind of, perhaps unglamorous is not the right word, but it's that kind of side that's not about the exciting show and the amazing sort of huge theatre aspect. Yes. But it's so important.
It's so rich, isn't it? It's lovely, the idea that behind all of this there is all that thought rather than, I don't want to particularly, bag Milan as it were, but you do feel that in Italy there is someone going, you have to do it in cashmere. And then told, and then you get all these people who are kind of junior Armanis, and no criticism at all to Mr. Armani, who I think is isn't he the single richest independent designer in the world? So he's evidently doing many things right. But will that be repeated? Is there a space for someone else like that in the world that we live in now? And in Milan, I'm always aware that we eat the same food. It's really delicious, and we see the same colour of mushroom or something on the catwalk and indeed on our plate. And here, I have no idea what I'm going to see, and that's always tremendously exciting. And there's nothing more uplifting to me than seeing a really great show that is unexpected. But then the downside, of course, is that we always run that risk, don't we? That sometimes we see a show in London and we go, God, what was that about? So it's a completely different kind of rhythm that we're on here.
Absolutely. I think that's also really exciting when you see the shows and you think, oh my God, what was that? But I think the other thing that's also been really exciting, that's really happened over the last, say, 5 years, with the work from the BSC, is that London actually gets behind London Fashion Week, whereas before you always felt that it was somehow something that was tolerated, and usually it was like, what can we cover in the papers or whatever that's the most outrageous and the least relevant, whereas now there is a sense that actually this is
part of the
really
it's
part of our creative economy. It's really important to us. So going to shows, I went to see PPQ last night which was obviously at Goldsmiths Hall. So these great venues that are then used for show work, and whether you like the collection or not, actually it's the fact that it's being showcased in London and parts of London that perhaps haven't necessarily been involved or used in the past, and I think that's also really important.
Can I interject, actually, sorry, but that thing of it is part of the British economy, and a very important part. That part of my writing portfolio, whatever, is I am the international fashion editor for the Australian Financial Review. So that pretty much spells out what kind of title it is, very serious financial title, with a very glossy magazine that looks about money. And my editor in Sydney emailed me the other day and said, I've received a book from the British Fashion Council. It has fascinating figures in. It was addressed to you. Shall I send it? And it had gone to Sydney, which is an address, is the right address to find me for that publication. It went to Sydney, an editor who's not, she's a very fashionable woman, but she's not, a fashion editor, had read it, and then it's just arrived back in London. London is looked at, Britain is looked at. It's not the way it was maybe 25 years ago when people would go, let's come to London because they'll do something weird in PVC.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, exactly.
And that goes back to that idea of it may not sound glamorous to be thinking about the production, the costings, etc. But that's actually what gives you the independence to be able to do your own thing, rather than then being subsumed by somebody else dictating to you which material you must use, which factory you must use. So that creates the independence.
But there's this huge range of designers I think we have here who will, whatever stage of their career they're at, you interview them and they say they owe their greatest debt to their college and then to things like Fashion East or to New Gen. And it just surprises me that we're not getting other cities copying that model and thinking, look at the talent they're churning out. This incredible rate and real talent.
I think that was interesting, because certainly in this discussion in Milan, there was a sort of sense, there were two things that were happening. The idea that as designers live longer and as the population live longer, so in a way they're there, as you say, you obviously reference, Giorgio Armani and so on, and yet they've got a stranglehold and not allowing the fact that fashion can be all of those things depending what age you are. But in a way you then have to let new designers come up with a completely different concept of what fashion might be. And that's where I think that we had the conversation about, is this possible to replicate it? But a number of things have to come together, which involves, obviously, industry support, but also government support, the fact that you need to identify certain spaces to nurture and develop incubator units. You've got to pull together a range of companies that include things like PR and advertising and so on and so forth, to really help make the relevance of designers and the growth of their businesses. And I think that's one of the great things about London. It's the infrastructure beyond the obvious, if you see what I mean, that is really important.
Yeah.
Also, I think we have our fashion academic system and our business system has a great symbiotic relationship. I mean, my background is as a fashion designer, and now I'm working with students and working in academia. A lot of my colleagues are the same, so we learn. It's very exciting for me to be working with other students as a designer. And the last few days we've been working with some of our designers, Chris Raven, Michelle Lohold and Matthew Miller, who are all showing this week, but also working at the same time with students. So it inspires the students inspire them, and there isn't this sort of silo of, oh, you're an academic, oh, you're a fashion designer and you're in business. And I think that is quite unique.
I'm interested in what you say about students, because I wanted to ask that, if that's a reason you think that our colleges do thrive so much. Because students can look at something like Fashionista and look at New Gen and say, you know what, I can actually become a fashion designer, I can do that. I'm not going to be held back because I can't afford to, rent my own studio as soon as I finish, because there's someone that's going to help me with that. And do you think that's part of the reason our colleges do thrive?
I do. I also think that the role of a designer and what it means to be a designer is diversifying, and graduates are seeing that. So they're seeing that maybe they're going to create a collection and start their own business, or maybe they're going to go into collaborations, or maybe they're going to use design thinking to solve problems in different industries. Because a designer in fashion can solve problems that can actually be useful to very different industries. And I think they're seeing both the ability to create something that's got their name on it and has got a catwalk show, but also that they can make a difference to the society they live in through working with others from different disciplines. And I think that idea of working across disciplines is really taking hold. I mean, we work with chemists from Sheffield, or social scientists from Durham, and that as well is making a very big difference, I think, to designers thinking about what their role is. It's not just about making clothes. Making clothes can be an amazing manifestation of design thinking, but there can be other things that they can do as well.
I think one of the things that's very exciting about fashion now is that, for me, it is the subject discipline for the 21st century. I mean, it touches so many different aspects and so many different things about what it is to be a human being operating in a really complex, interconnected world. And obviously, economically, so many companies recognise that it is a key driver. The quality of the design, I sometimes describe it as a bit like the cappuccino effect. I mean, you can go and get a 50p cup of coffee in a plastic mug or whatever, or you're prepared to pay £5 for something which is, in a beautiful china cup and whatever, as we have here. And it's that sort of...
It tastes so much better.
It does. And it's partly because it looks so much better as well. And I think that that's what we've got, and that's what we understand here. And I think one of the other things is that we are doing a project. Dilys referenced a couple of the work that we're doing with chemists and so on, but we're doing one, for example, with neuroscientists on addiction and why women are addicted to buying shoes. I mean, which is just to try and understand some of the things like what does make fashion cool. Why do we want to have a particular object? Why would we spend £5 on a cup of coffee as opposed to 50p? And it's that sort of relevance that other disciplines are beginning to get that I think we offer in a way that no other country does, and that's why people want to come and study here as well.
When your students leave or are about to leave and you're talking to them about, well, these are your career opportunities, if we'd met 15, 20 years ago, I would imagine that students would be saying, I really want to work at Donna Karan or something. What do they say now? Where do they want to go?
I think more and more of them want to do their own thing again. It's good. We were talking about the references behind some of these collections as being from punk and from an era where people were going out and doing something different and challenging the way that businesses were running and society was running, and the government was telling us what to do. I think that's coming around again. And rather than aspiring to the big brands, I think graduates are aspiring either to set their own business up or go and do something that isn't about just going straight back into the system. So yeah, I think that aspiration's really changed.
What
really
about
changing.
the kind of LVMH, PPR? You know, we're at this moment in time where, you know, we used to talk about designers. I mentioned Armani afterwards, but the next era has been these mega umbrella luxury brands. LVMH obviously being the biggest, and then Richemont, and then PPR, which has brands like Gucci, etc. But do your students, are they saying, I want to get into those companies, or are they kind of burned now by?
I mean, I think it's a mix. There would be some. I mean, you know, at the college we do, you know, everything from, you know, buying and merchandising and fashion management all the way through to journalism and PR and so on, everything that the fashion industry encompasses. So we will have students who are interested in what it is to work in a company like that, in a luxury company, and how do you sustain the brands under those sorts of contexts. So we're really committed to that, and for some of our students that's really important. But I do think we are in another time. I think we're not quite seeing it all just yet. And I was quite sort of coincidentally, I was talking to somebody who's a sort of textile specialist, and he's done a lot of work. He works actually at the University of Derby, and he's done a lot of work looking at how textiles, how they were worn in the early sort of polar explorations and also climbing Everest. And he was saying there are some of the companies that were used then, so people like Smedley's and one or two others, which were family-owned, quite small, very focused companies, are still in business today. And I think for me, the thing that's quite interesting are those big multinational global companies where the shareholders are the ones, you know, you're always having to give back to those sorts of companies. Is that sustainable? Is the creative impetus, is the sort of ethical dimension, the sort of real focus on why you're offering the sort of product in the way that you are? I'm not so sure that that's really sustainable when you get to be, because, and again, you know, one department doesn't talk properly to another. You know, there are all of those sorts of things that begin to enter into and make it more complex. And I think that's what our students are spotting as well.
Yeah. I think instead of having a sort of almost sycophantic view of the brand and wanting to go and work for a brand, they'll admire particular designers and particular brands, but they will go in there with quite a critical eye. And I think that ability to have a critical analysis of what you're doing has become stronger. So they'll go in there, but they'll go in there with questions rather than going in there going, oh yes, please employ me.
I'm interested that you mentioned the complexity, because that's something I was actually going to ask you, Marion, about how the ways in which fashion has changed. So we talked about things like PR, and we talked about that, just that complexity and that level of things that a young person has to think about when they're starting out, or any designer has to think about throughout their career. Do you think that's something that has changed, that kind of, I guess it's related to the pace of fashion, but do you think that's something that's becoming sort of ever harder for a designer to sort of...
No, I actually think the opposite. It's strange because some of the images that are flashing up on that screen as we wait for the streaming to start, there's this one that I can see now which to me is very reminiscent of a kind of John Galliano moment. And as we're talking, he is the person in my head that I'm thinking, you know, from seeing an extraordinarily talented young designer as he was, you know, when John and I are about the same age. I think maybe I'm a year younger than him or something. So I've watched him from the very, very beginning, and that just fizzing, fantastic brilliance of those early collections from Students to onwards. And of course, we all know the end. I mean, it's not the end. Of course, what has happened to him is not the end, but it's the end of a certain arc of his life. And it was a very... you know, I'm not for a minute going to talk about what he said, and we all know what he said, and we all have taken our views on that. But for someone to lose everything in such a dramatic and such a public way, and also, you know, recently with the new French political administration, for him to have been stripped of his Légion d'honneur, which is, I think, particularly sort of galling in a way for us sitting here as Brits, because, you know, here you can bring a bank down and still keep your title of Sir. So, but I'm wondering if for students now, you know, looking at these creations by people in their early 20s, if there is a sense that maybe
he's a haunting figure to them because he had the ultimate success. I mean, it is like a grim fairy story, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting observation, because I think, as we know, in a way, the fashion machine has got faster and faster. If you're a designer, particularly operating that sort of level, you have to produce so many collections, and actually nobody can sustain that sort of intensity, that sort of level of creative output without having time to reflect and put things back, because otherwise you're just on this, terrible sort of treadmill, which is so unforgiving. And I think that's one of the things that also our students are looking at, not just because of the sort of the cost that means to you personally, but also there are big questions, as Dilys will know better than anybody sitting here, about the ethical dimension and the sort of sustainability of that. And actually, if you're looking for beautiful clothes and you have a limited sort of income, the fact is, what is your style? The fact that you can relentlessly go out buying stuff all of the time is not a model. I think we're all saying, what is the new dimension of capitalism that we might need to be evolving right now? And for me, that everything that happened to John Galliano was sort of epitomised in that idea that you've got this big money machine and you have to carry on, and if you get burnt out, well, tough, you get spat out.
And that idea that actually you're powerful, but really you're powerless.
Yeah,
and
absolutely,
really,
you're powerless.
People are critiquing fashion, as well as asking those critical questions. I think that thinking about our identities, that idea of sense of belonging and how we manifest that through our clothes is being thought of very differently. Instead of just thinking it's about churning it out, it's about, fashion is two things. It's artistic practice, and then there's this huge machine that has now become what people identify as fashion. But actually, that's a business model of churning it out. That's not fashion.
No,
that's somebody
absolutely.
capitalising on fashion.
Yeah, it is,
so we've got to
it
draw
is.
back and think about it as an artistic practice, as a way that we identify ourselves in the world. It's a vital part of how we communicate with each other, what we look like, and I think we've got to draw back from the machine and actually think about other ways to manifest our ability to make our living out of it, because we need to be able to thrive, we need to be able to carry on. So as Frances said, other models around business are starting to emerge. And a lot of our students are very politically motivated now. They're looking at what New Economics Foundation are saying about post-growth economies, etc. So I think there is a politicisation of fashion design, but not in the way that it has happened in the past, where people are out striding down the streets with banners. They're actually thinking, I'm going to do business in a different way.
That is so new, and it's so encouraging, because going back to, say, John Galliano's generation of those designers, obviously I've interviewed them many times over the years, and when they were young, the idea of asking, even saying the word politics, I mean, not, of course, to ask an impertinent question like, which way do you vote? but to have any notion that in an interview situation in that hour that you would mention anything about politics in its wider terms, or explore anything about the sustainability of fashion or any of those issues, it's so encouraging now that it's absolutely central to the way people think. I interview a lot of heads of companies, business brains, and one of the things that's always on my list of question is, tell me about your CSR. And 10 years ago, CSR, corporate social responsibility, honestly, I'd never heard the term. I don't know when it was coined, but I certainly had no idea what it meant, and they certainly were not into answering it. And now it's something that the biggest companies, Chanel, companies like that, will answer, will address, which is also so it's very positive. From I keep pointing at the screen because the the thing that's very distracting though is we're talking about this wonderful depth of fashion, and in between there's these tweets flashing up saying things like amazing messy hair.
but I think that is where it's exciting, because we on the one hand are doing something quite serious, on the other hand we have to have fun with it. And unless you're having fun with it, actually nobody's going to be interested. So
I want to tie that a bit to, because a lot of the stuff we just mentioned actually ties really closely to the three designers who we're showing as part of Fashion East. So it's Claire Barrow, who we already mentioned, and then Marion Lowe and Martin van der Horst. Because we talked about this kind of politicisation of fashion, and two of those designers showing today, so Claire and Martin, are referencing punk in their collections. I think it's interesting that, as we said, designers are willing, that they want to kind of make these statements and think about things in a new way, whether it's in how they actually produce their clothes, or, as you said, whether it's how they do their business. Do you think there's something quite telling in that reference to punk?
I do. I think actually, from what you were just saying, Marion, I think that the bigger companies are starting to address their ethical dimensions, but I think that these guys are realising that maybe that's a lot of noise on the outside and it's not enough. So these guys are being a bit more gutsy with it. So that those references to punk, those references to being a bit more agitating with what they're doing, I think that is maybe because there is a little bit of a gloss on the outside of some things, and there's some businesses doing great things, and big businesses can't be that radical. So these guys are seeing themselves as being the place where we need to see radical change. So I think that's quite interesting.
I think the other aspect, obviously, is that the internet, the ability that young designers have to be able to obviously show on, to sell their work online. They've got all the social media. You've got that sort of sense that ideas can permeate. You can produce a video, talk about your work or whatever, and everybody can be a part of that. That idea of a sort of democracy, and the idea of being able to fight against the establishment in a way is almost easier. Well, it is much easier than it was in the days of punk. That idea of the sort of social revolution that you might be able to have, and the sort of subversive nature, and how fashion can, in a way portray that, I think is also very telling. And I think, in the end, fashion ought to be anarchic. And I think it's really good that people are looking back to those, that radical rethinking, that ability to sort of challenge and question, and actually to be so overt in the way that you're dressing was one of the great things about punk. And the way we'd become, the thing was terrible. Everybody's so lazy about dress for this whole sort of period of, t-shirts and jeans or whatever, just to have some sort of thrill going back into using your clothes to portray something and to fight against that, I think is really exciting.
Yeah, it is, because people have almost forgotten that because of the homogeneity of us all wearing the same thing, of stuff that's churned out. And for a while, people were asking the question about sustainability and fashion, and whether there was a paradox. And actually, no, both of them are challenging the status quo. It's obvious, but we've forgotten that that's what fashion is
can be about.
It will be interesting to see, though, how punk is analysed now in two ways. One, because punk has such a sort of immediate shock factor, or new punk, or we're going to have to call it something, but if it's going to be it's going to need a new name.
Repunked.
The shock of whenever it was, 1978, to replicate that now, you need to react immediately, and the world of social media means that you can. So on one side, that makes it much, much more exciting, and also takes away that funny thing I remember from the early 80s when, Vogue decided it would suddenly have to address punk, and there was strange makeup, and then of course Zandra
a few safety pins.
I can't remember the date that Zandra did her brilliant safety pin dress, but the way it segued from the street fashion, I think looking at it now, was quite clumsy. So how now this reaction can be much faster, and is it going to be in a way more authentic?
I think it's very difficult, because in a way we've come so far. I mean, what is shocking now is because also punk did encapsulate that idea of challenging sort of social class political structures. And I think there isn't any, in a way there's no visual imagery, there's no, because of the internet, everything's available, everything's been seen, everything's been done. So I think, what does that mean then to shock in that sort of way is quite difficult, isn't it, I think?
What's interesting about something like punk, and the things we were talking about, the way in which sort of all that information's out there, and what is it to challenge someone now? I think it's kind of integral to this rawness of London designers, in that they operate in that way, and they're not afraid to try things, and whether it is doing on a very obvious level, so taking something like punk to inspire their collection, or whether it's even using a completely different technique based on something they sort of found around Soho, and that rawness, I think it is very authentic now, and I think it's a kind of a make do and mend attitude, which I think is quite, if you look at someone like Martin van der Horst, who's showing today his graduate collection, when he sewed those net tutus onto his Hawaiian prints, and Claire Barrow when she's painting on leather, and it is that kind of, you can't imagine that happening somewhere else. And I think people talk about their generation of these kind of young fashionista designers as if it's this kind of churning things out, this kind of constant consumerism, but you actually look at the items we've got on show today, whether it's that painted leather or this kind of the stitched together net and the sequins, and there's kind of a rawness and an authenticity, which
I think that idea of the authenticity and integrity of the designers and what they reference the historical references, again, if you go back to looking at some of the Paris collections or Milan collections, they tend to reference particular parts of history that are looking at elite, what's happening in the elite, whereas I think a lot of the London designers will reference historical, social context. So they'll be looking at different parts of history and what's happening in society.
Why is that always London's stomping ground? Why has it always been that kind of...
It's the way that we live, isn't it? Because if you think of a city like Paris, where you basically have a lot of extremely rich people in a small geographical space, ringed by a big road, and then a lot of extremely poor people on the outside. And the interaction is not the same as, of course, that's a gross generalisation, but, if you really think of Paris and the chicness of Paris, it has a lot to do with wealth. Whereas wherever you live in London, your next door neighbour can be a multimillionaire hedge fund guy, and your neighbour on the other side can be in, welfare housing. I mean, we're much more mixed, and we address that in our day-to-day lives, and we address it literally in the way we dress. So it's bound to be the city that's the most creative. And the thing we've managed not to mention this far on is, for all our creativity and the wonderful things we have all the time, of course now we have this tremendous optimism, and the idea that the Olympics could have anything to do with fashion, when one saw, no criticism of Stella, I think she did a very good job with the uniforms, but those absolutely horrendously dreadful things at the very, very nice Olympic, what were the volunteers called? Games makers.
The games makers.
Every time I saw those epaulets, I just felt like, the Olympics are so wonderful, please remove the epaulets. But strangely, does that segue also into fashion, that wonderful optimism and that wonderful uniting thing? And we're coming off that bounce, as it were. Is that also filtering into this London Fashion Week? Because we feel much more positive about each other. We feel much more can-do. And that might be interesting at the end of Fashion Week to see if there has been any real effect there.
And a lot of the designers, their studios are near to the Olympic Park, and over the last few days I've been down there seeing people in their studios, and you do feel as if there's a very different buzz around the place, and there is a sort of afterglow from the Olympics, and I think that does seep into, if people are creating collections in that kind of vibe, I think it is, it's making a big difference to how people's outlook on the way that they're working.
There's a geographical shift too, isn't there? Because I know going to see Marion Hume at his studio, it felt like going off the edge of the world. And now of course, it's right in the middle of
everything.
I think, we are getting to our images in a second. This is just Martin van der Horst right at the end. I'll just do a refresh. But I think it'd be nice to have a look at the designs and what they're producing. Neil, I'm having a problem with a tech link. Can you help me out? Thank you. And I'm interested that you mentioned that sort of geographic element, and there's this kind of community, because I think that's something that fashion's kind of become a lot more involved in London, whether it's kind of even little things like fashion at the Olympics. So many of the opening ceremony costumes were designed by young sort of young members of the fashion community, and you've got that kind of element of fashion seeping everywhere, which I think is something, we all said this about London, but it's something so positive, and people feel much more at home in London. Sorry about this. Sorry. Should we just keep going?
Yeah, carry on.
So should we talk a little bit about the three designers that are showing? So because we all kind of mentioned Claire Barrow as someone who we were struck by, and I think she's such an example of that London, I'm going to take something old, she's taking old leather pieces and painting them, and it's that kind of excitement of take something and reinvent it. And we've also got Ryan Lowe, he's not trained in the traditional sense that Claire and Martin have been, so he's self-taught, which I think they really personify in a really nice way what sort of London designers can do, because on the other end you've got Martin, who went to Central St Martin's and had that more traditional route, and in that spectrum there you've got kind of what London fashion can be. It can be someone who's grown up, always wanted to be a fashion designer, sort of trained very traditionally, and as much as St Martin's can be traditional, and then you've got someone like Ryan who learnt from watching YouTube videos, as he says. And do you think that's a positive message that people, like your students, can look at and go, yeah, I don't have to?
I think the idea of not being cookie cutter in what you're doing and how you're doing it and how you approach it is very important, and I think the mix of having the design skills and the making skills that you can have through different routes, I think is important. I do think that ultimately underneath it all, you do need to be able to have those technical skills, and I think unless you've got those, I don't know that much about Ryan's background, but I'm sure that for him, he's found different routes into it, but I think you've got to have that underpinning for you to be able to then have your own creativity, because unless I think unless you can cut a pattern, unless you can make the pieces yourselves, I think you don't really get an understanding of how things are on a body.
Yeah.
So there's different routes into that, but I think that those skills underpin everything.
Yeah. Do you think that sometimes gets ignored with London because there is this kind of vibrancy and this brightness to the clothing, and there's a lot of embellishment? And do you think sometimes the kind of actual real hard work and incredible technique and just incredible skill that goes into some of the items does get a little bit eclipsed by the visual excitement of what you're seeing?
I think you do see that, and I think actually, people going into stores now, looking at the way things are made, I think there's a lot more understanding of the intricacies of how things are created. I think what we've lost is knowing how to make things ourselves. And I think through schooling, we've lost that whole education in how you make things.
Yeah.
It's just been taken out of the school curriculum. I think that's so sad, because unless you can make things yourself, you can't really feel as if you've got some ownership over it. So if you've got something you've bought and something goes wrong with it and you can't fix it or you can't do something with it, then you're powerless over it. And I think that we need to look at education across the whole spectrum and think about how kids interact with the pieces around, whether it's fashion or whether it's a piece of technology. Unless you can take it apart and do things with it and tweak with it, you kind of, it's redundant, and that's why things are redundant so easily and so quickly. Because the minute something doesn't quite work in the way it did before, you don't think, how can I fix that, or how can I improve it? You just chuck it and get another one. And I think we've got to really address that and ensure that our kids get the opportunity to be able to remember how to make things and have those skills brought back into the curriculum.
Yeah. Before we look at the images, I've just got one question which I want to ask Marion, which I meant to ask in the start, which is you've kind of looked quite a lot at different sort of phenomena in your work. So you identified the it bag phenomenon, you looked at that. Would you say that there's something, can you see any of those same sort of huge trends that are happening at the moment?
Actually, the it bag thing, I really shouldn't claim, and I know exactly why now. We've just come back hopefully from somewhat, in my case, brief summer holidays, but that always means you can read something other than fashion. And I was reading Hilary Mantel, Bring Up the Bodies, which is the follow-up to Wolf Hall, which won the Booker. And there is the best description ever in that book of an it bag. And that book is full of the most brilliant fashion writing. Oh, it's full of the most brilliant writing, obviously, but I read it and I said, my goodness, the it bag dates from 1540, whenever when was Anne Boleyn executed? I'm sorry, I'm not very good on dating.
I really should know that.
But whenever. And it was, gentlemen that were following fashion. So all of these things go back.
But has that kind of lust for something luxurious changed now? Because to me that seems a kind of an antiquated trend.
I worry it's actually gone too far. I don't worry. I observe that it's gone too far the other way. I almost think that, how there should be rules that you can't, as a young girl, walk down the catwalk until you're 16. I would say 18, but I guess the law says 16. I think there should be a law that it doesn't matter how rich you are, you cannot have a Birkin until you're 25. There should be certain things. It's like, no, you are too young.
We've lost the art of anticipation.
It is. I mean, the idea that you save up for something, that there is something, that, whether it is a bag or a dress or whatever, you covet it and you think about it. In a way, it picks up on Dilys's point also about the fact that, you want to have an emotional attachment to your bag or your item of clothing, because actually it means something. And so you do want to know how to look after it properly, which might mean you've got to be able to repair it or polish it or whatever
and
it is.
And you want to treasure it. Rather than have a bag that the minute it's in your hand, it starts to, in a way, depreciate. That you start to love it less because you now own it. Whereas the older idea of, buying a pair of boots and saving and wanting them, or a pair of shoes, and sleeping with them at the end of your bed.
Yes, absolutely.
I love
Yeah.
that thing of walking up and down Slough High Street. How glamorous is that? Where there was a pair of shoes at one end and a pair of shoes at the other, and I could, of course, only have one, and only one over a long period of time, and that big debate of which to have. And I still remember it, and there's a wonderful thrill of that. And I wonder if this thing of, you can have this, or you can have that, you can have everything, takes that away, and what that's doing to our feelings of ownership.
I completely agree. It takes it away, because you used to have to save up. You couldn't get it. You couldn't sort of put it on your credit card or whatever it was, and then so you lose that capacity to really plan and think about, well, if I buy this and I can't buy that, what does that mean? I think, and the idea that clothes, you used to leave them in your will, or used to pass them on to your a member of your family or whatever it was. So if you didn't want it, I mean, that sort of. I think that is so important, that investment in whatever it is that you buy.
That idea of heirloom, and it's something
something that's precious.
And it is part of what we love as humans. We love that sense of excitement before something happens, and the anticipation, because that's when you start to imagine things. And if all the excitement is in the purchase, is in the consumer experience of being in a store, and it's almost lost before you've got, as you're walking home with it, it's depreciating as you walk down there. I mean, that's not going to be a sense of real achievement or fulfillment, but it does actually play into a great business model as far as consumption is concerned, and that's what a lot of business have predicated their ideas on, around being able to have reduced margins just so that you can have that churn. But we need to break away from that for so many reasons, because it's not creating fulfillment and satisfaction.
Emptiness it creates, actually. I think that's the thing that's really awful about it. It's like it becomes a sort of want, and it's nothing to do with it's nothing to do with clothes, nothing to do with liking clothes. It's just having stuff.
Yeah. Should we have a look at some of the fashionistas? So this is Marion Hume, whose pieces are coming in. I think what's interesting is I look at this, and to me this does have that kind of do-it-yourself. You don't have to go and buy this wonderful look from an incredibly old established house. You can kind of create something that looks incredible based on the things you can find. And Marion Hume, we mentioned him before. It's interesting because he's not trained traditionally, like the others are. He's a new recruit to Fashionista this season. And he's kind of self-taught in a way.
I also love the idea of display as well, display of clothes, display of colour, display of texture, because again, that's one of the things that in a way fashion sometimes is lost on the street, is that people, it's bland, it's a sort of beige this and a sort of pastel that. You can't criticise fashionistas. No, I mean, it's fantastic,
Beautiful, gorgeous.
It is gorgeous.
It's really exciting.
It does.
I think what's interesting as well is the kind of fabric that he uses. So in previous collections, we can have a look at stuff he's done before. It's this idea you can just bring things together. Anything you can see, whether it's kind of tinsel, whether it's net, can be brought in and created into clothing. And I think that's such an exciting sort of dynamic idea that you can go back to this one. That you can.
It's such a joyous colour palette, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We're seeing these lovely, ravishing pinks and hot reds, and there's something very uplifting, says she wearing black, but there's something very sort of uplifting and gorgeous about these.
And also the reflective nature. I mean, I love the fact that the textures are such an integral part as well of the collection.
He's calling them disco China dolls, which I think
sums it up quite well.
But it's fashion as happiness. It's what we were talking about. This idea that your clothes, they make you happy, they make you excited. You don't kind of feel uncomfortable or restrained by them.
How practical, though, that as a disco China doll, instead of bringing a clutch bag that you have to dance around, you bring your own chair that's to perch at the bar.
But I think that's one thing that's so exciting with Fashionista, I think, is like how they display their clothes. We saw that with their kind of men's installation last season, when they just had this wonderful house and every room was so exciting. It was fashion as fantasy in the best way. And I think that's what pushes these designers to be so creative and exciting.
They also feel very versatile as well.
Yeah.
Don't they?
Well, if you look at some of the designers that are quite, so someone like Simone Rocha, who's a kind of more recent graduate of Fashionista, and what she's doing is so different to this. It's much more minimal, much more pared back, but still equally as kind of joyous and creative. And I think there is that versatility to Fashionista. It's easy, I think, some people, as you said, think of it as London kind of, they'll just do something crazy. And I think it's easy to think of Fashionista as kind of all this bright colour and excitement, but actually when you pull it back, there's a huge range of different designers with very different aesthetics and very different ideas of what fashion can be coming out of there.
That's such a London look though, isn't it?
It is.
The strapless evening gown with a nice solid flat shoe.
Interesting hair as well.
That is what we think, isn't it? You know, a night out in London, the chances are it's going to end late and you're going to end up on a bus. So,
and that's
a very practical idea.
And you got it spot on, because it's actually designing for girls that want to go out, have a great time, look fantastic, but also want to be able to get home. And you can feel that with looking at these collections. You know you have a good night out in those things.
Yeah, that is an outfit to have fun in. So that was Marion Lowe there. So we mentioned that they've done the Fashionistas have traditionally done. They've done 3 shows on a catwalk. All 3 of their designers show. Whereas this season they've pared it back and done these installations, which I think is actually quite interesting because you get this idea of, as you said, kind of closes presentation. So this is Claire Barrow, who's inspired by alcohol, and she's got all the bottles lined up behind her. And I think there's something kind of really nice about that. It's taking away that kind of the drama of the runway, but it's not making it any less exciting and any less sort of splendid.
It's taken us a long time to get there. I mean, reference back when I was working with Catherine Hamnett, Catherine's so passionate about not having just that runway as the only means to be able to express your ideas. But we made a film of one of the collections, and it was at a time when the fashion press were not ready for being able to see something in a different format, and there was very little coverage of the show because of that, and obviously that impacts on your sales, on how the stores around Europe see you.
Expensive for young designers, I think.
And it's such a one-way route, and there has to be more versatility in the way that we show what we're making, what we're creating. But we're starting to see that, and I mean, look at that. You can actually, you can imagine the good night out. And whereas if you see the runway, you're only seeing one dimension of a collection.
You know, in American Vogue, they have that thing, runway to reality. It's like, well, let's just leave the runway bit out. Here's reality. I'm in the bar and the drinks are lined up.
And I look really cool.
This is Claire Barrow here, who we've all kind of been quite sort of struck by her work. So we've seen this is what she did with Joseph, and it's this signature painted leather. It's just fantastic. This is previous work she's done. So we can go back and have a look. And this season, inspired by alcohol, which I love. It's that rawness, you know, it's kind of what different drinks and...
I think also, the other thing, thinking from an education perspective, we're always talking to the students about the fact that your inspiration can come from so many different sources. And I think that's also quite exciting for people who are aspiring to go to art college or whatever, to understand that you don't just look at Vogue or you don't just look at the established ideas about fashion. You look at, and that's where your inspiration is going to come from.
And you paint gin across the front.
Absolutely.
I must say, I love this press release. I love the fact that it says embroidery and handmade silver charms reference alcoholic packaging. I mean, it's making us sound like 4 great lushes after a big night out. But if, you know, as a journalist, you spend a lot of time waiting at shows, and sometimes I even find myself forced to read the press release that is provided. And it usually says things like, you know, our inspiration comes from, you know, Phil here, ancient duchess that you've never heard of. And it always really means my mother. And suddenly here is someone that's inspired by possibly her own lifestyle, and quite honestly, so it seems very exciting to me.
Is that the silk kimono, do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, that looks very interesting as a contrast to the sort of painted leather.
It's inspired by bourbon whiskey, which I love. She's looked at different sort of aesthetics, different fabrics based on different types of alcohol. So the paper shirt by tequila, then the 50s shirt in wool, which is a martini. And it's just so refreshing to see someone having fun. It's what you said.
And a bit of wit and humour, and not taking yourself too seriously, but being really passionate about what you do.
And no one's telling her to do it in cashmere. Definitely, you can see good advice from Lulu Kennedy.
They wouldn't listening.
But I think what's nice about someone like Claire Barrow is you look at it and you see there's so much room for her to grow, I think, as a designer, and you can see how kind of something like Fashionista, it's going to push her each season. She can't just rest on her laurels, which I think you can see that even with someone like Simone Rocher or Martin van der Horst moving through and how they're...
I think also the interesting thing again about this collection is that you have a sense that people could take an element. You wouldn't necessarily appeal to all sorts of people who want to get a bit of edginess or a bit of, you know, the support for a young designer that's just coming through.
Well, as much as it's fun, as much as it is definitely humorous and witty and exciting and playful, it's savvy as well, because something like a leather jacket, everyone wants a leather jacket, everyone's owned a leather jacket at some point, everyone wears them, and you can see something like that. She can get a little piece of her sort of world and her aesthetic into everyone's wardrobe in such a simple way.
And I imagine that's probably where it comes back down to the mentoring through Fashionista, because on the one hand they're being supported to do their own thing and be creative. On the other hand, they've got mentors that are helping them without stifling it to say, you know what, you've got to think about different kinds of people who are going to be wearing your clothes, and you've got to be thinking about different audiences, so that you can build your business out of it. So yeah, that savviness comes, I think, from those interactions and from understanding how to build their business, so that when they are designing, they're not just thinking about their muse or just thinking about their own lifestyle or just having fun for the sake of having fun. They're actually thinking about what it can do to build their business.
Yeah. There's a criticism there, though, isn't there, of Dilys, what you were saying about how in education we've removed the classes that were called things like needlework, and that whole idea of training you to make things has completely disappeared. And instead we're seeing this leather jacket that I'm looking at it going, I think it's great, but I'm looking going, why would you buy it? Why wouldn't you do it yourself? And of course the answer is people no longer know how to do it themselves.
Yes,
and that's actually quite disturbing, that you might take a kind of graffitied and whatever we're going to call punk jacket, and yet you have not created it. You have gone and spent a considerable amount of money on it. That's very different from punk of 1975 or 78.
Which is when the bin liner.
Play with that almost. I don't think Claire in particular is kind of maybe play with it. Someone like Jill Sander, when they created that paper bag, that lunchbox paper bag as a bag, and people bought it, and it was £200 for a piece of paper, and you could have just written.
It's just such a sign of the times, though. Or it was. I do think that is changing. I think. I mean, again, this discussion is a bit like food as well. The fact that so many people don't know how to, so many kids don't know how to cook, or the idea that you've got to go back in and introduce some of these things back into school because you're not going to learn it at home because again, families don't know how to cook or don't know how to sew or repair things, and it is a real sort of indictment on, in a way, being sold a particular form of capitalism, that this is the model, you have to buy and chuck it if you don't like it anymore, it's going to be really cheap. Actually it just isn't a sustainable business model, and it's not good for us as it's not aesthetically or intrinsically pleasing to how we are.
Yeah, because it isn't genuine. Because if you're buying something that looks as if you've altered it yourself, but actually you've bought into the brand because it's already been done for you, it's not authentic. So yeah, there is a little bit of a question actually around some of those sorts of pieces that have got a built-in, already worn look. I mean, we've seen it through the jeans industry for many years. That you're buying something that looks as if it's had a life and it's had this great experience of doing things, but you've actually got these sandblasted areas on it, which is actually just a fake life that it's lived.
Well, it's more than fake, if we're going
on every level.
It is. I mean, sandblasting is one of those areas of fashion that we should be so much more aware of how hideous it is for your jeans to look like someone else wore them. Someone else may have died for them. I mean, that's the simple equation of sandblasting. So I think any young designer that we see doing them needs, you two especially, to take them out.
Well,
we're talking to, I'm sure you do.
It's a bit like not being able to wear a Birkin until you're 26 or whatever it is.
We shouldn't be
principles here and we're all going to stick by. But I think coming back to that point about the sort of painted leather or what it is that you do as a designer, is then the challenge is back to you to say, well, the reason that people are going to buy it is because actually, yes, they may have an idea about how it's done, but to actually do it, or the quality is, the materials are really good, and the way it's been done. Absolutely, that's the bit, the craft in it, because I think that's the thing that people are going to want. Then you really value it because you also understand that yes, you might think you can do it. It's a bit like people saying, oh, look at Picasso, oh, I could do that, or my 5-year-old could do it. And actually, the reality is that it's more complex than that.
But I think that's what I love about fashionistas. It is kind of the. Do you think someone like Claire Barrow saying, I'm going to take an item that someone's worn, someone's loved, and paint on it? That, as much as it's kind of, someone could do that themselves, there is that element of going against all that's meant to be something new.
And as you said, she's done it in a way that actually you couldn't do yourself. So that's where, sorry, maybe I didn't make it. That's where it's the difference between the sandblasted jean that actually is just a complete nonsense, and something here that actually is something that is a craft and a skill that only she can do.
And the more we're seeing of these pieces, the more the skill is becoming
evident.
That's something that's great about fashionistas, because there is this rawness to it, but I think the skill is so evident, and we've seen that in the techniques in these collections.
Well, this is why people want to come to London, because actually they want to see the paper shirt and skirt. It's absolutely fantastic.
Tequila, I love that.
Yeah, it is.
There's been so much buzz on Twitter about Claire Barry. I think she's one of those ones where it's just kind of everyone's loved this, and it's not hard to see why. So this is now Martin van der Horst, which it's actually very interesting given that what we were just talking about, because he's taken inspirations from 70s punk, but he's also looked at items as simple as kind of plastic shopping bags that you get when you go to the supermarket and taken inspiration from there.
As you can see the Tesco's reference
Yeah.
in there, can't you?
But that's such, it's so nice. It goes back to something that all these designers in their own way, they've looked at the items around them and taken inspiration from that.
Is that the Tesco's one we just saw? I mean, we're presuming that's a print based on the Tesco's carrier bag, because if the real brilliance would be if he could take it the full way and make us actually want to wear all the plastic bags that are, you know, forming mountains around the slums of Nairobi. I mean,
there's an amazing company that we've done some work with in India called Conserve, which is actually it's a charity that was set up really to help the women who were doing the picking of the rubbish. And they were collecting together all the plastic, and then they've actually developed a technology that can turn it into material. So you can get Tesco's plastic bag material. And
this is just a print, which is a shame.
Yeah, so yeah.
But maybe if he becomes aware of that, Dilys, he can use it. And through fashion, we're then finding the answer to really a global problem. So the notion that we're discussing politics with fashion and how political fashion is there's a great example.
Well, these designers, you can tell actually they're not sort of shying away from that. You know, he's referenced 70s punk. I think they always want people they definitely want to challenge with their clothes, and I think that's so positive. You know, they're not afraid of saying like, this is what I think, or this is what you can think based on what I've created. And I think that's so gutsy in a way at such a young age. I think it's
that garment that we can just see from the back now, you can clearly see has got the actual Tesco logo
in
on
his
it.
press release, he says it's silk screen printed with a wild patchy mashup of slogans and stolen high street logos inspired by New York no-wave imagery.
I think these are very strong collections, aren't they?
All
All three designers.
And this idea of the sort of the anti-establishment,
fantastic.
I love that
the bandana.
And something like Dr. Noki has been doing the slash the brand for a while, and that whole idea about taking those big brands and being able to democratize this idea of fashion through looking at brands in a tongue-in-cheek way by pulling the logos apart.
But you don't only get something like that in London. I think people
you'd never get
they
it
feel
anywhere
like they have the community they can say something like this, and I think it's just fantastic that someone like Martin can do this. He can do his creative vision at such a young age, fresh out of college, but there's also the support mechanisms for that.
But also that you'd never get it in Milan even if it was printed on cashmere, would you?
No.
But I think what's interesting about these three collections is they do sort of somehow epitomise what London is about, but they're all incredibly different. They're so different, very different, but also very confident.
But I think that's the success of fashionistas as well, as they've always picked a kind of a real range of designs. So when you look at someone like James Long, who's just come out of there, he's doing something so different to what the other designers there are doing. So they always manage to avoid this sense that they're just kind of churning designers out, because they always seem to really handpick people that have their similarities that bounce off each other. And I think that's why it's lasted sort of 12 years. It's got a spot on schedule now. No one would look at it and say it doesn't deserve that place. And it's an incredibly sort of skilled institution, I think.
What's great too is you can see that there's no defined taste. There's not someone behind it that's saying, I want you to do it a bit like this. It's obviously very free. Just with these three examples, they are so different from each other, but all exciting in their own way.
And you can see how someone like Martin's come on, because obviously he started doing his Hawaiian prints, and he's obviously stayed in print, and it's something he's keen on, but the fact that he's managed to kind of keep an aesthetic while also moving from sort of three different collections and doing something very different for each. And I think there's something really warming to see a young designer come into their stride and have support and not kind of get lost along the way or feel like they have to try something too new. And that's, I think, it's the kind of, that side of fashionista that perhaps doesn't get the most press, but is the greatest side of it, that mentorship.
And they're really confident collections, as you said, Marion. They all look very different from each other, so there isn't this kind of dictatorship of we want fashionistas to look like this. It's being able to, see the strength and skills in very different ways, and all the guys that have come up previously, very different again, so there isn't an aesthetic that they're looking for.
I really love the cut of that, actually. That's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. But the print, I mean, throughout, the fabric and the print, the design really work.
But I think what's clever here is you can see the more commercial side. He's done something that's more pared back, that's very wearable, alongside those kind of wittier pieces at the start.
It goes back to the sort of Hawaiian shirt, you know, some of those early pieces, but again, taking it in a completely different way.
Well, there's almost a simplicity to what he... I know it's very visually strong, but there is that kind of simplicity and that pared back kind of... He just does these beautiful clothes that make a statement, and there's something quite witty about them, but they're never kind of... There's more of a vibe to them. I think you wouldn't look at any of those models and kind of just think that they were wearing some kind of ridiculous creation. There's that sense of kind of attitude and confidence with them.
There's a proper strategy here, isn't there? He's within this collection, he's looked at the whole thing and gone, okay, well, I'm going to send these Tesco ones down because they're going to get tweeted everywhere in the papers, and then here are these much more... You're right, they aren't wearable, and that's something I wasn't expecting at all. Kind of quite beautifully done.
I just love as well that it's shown with such a gorgeous kind of spiky high heel. Yes, it's just like,
go to go.
So lovely.
Actually, really, what you want to do is you all want to go off go shopping in Tesco's wearing one of these. Just see if anybody knows.
Just kind of fashioning their own Martin Vanderbilts out of Tesco bags.
Well, if Tesco's are smart, they'd realise the best thing they could do is to support this.
This is the clothing look there, so I think it really sums up Fashionista, doesn't it? Because it's beautifully created, it's perfectly tailored, but it's so wonderful as well, just in terms of those patterns and those visuals.
And you wouldn't get it anywhere else, would you? I mean, you wouldn't go New York, Paris, Milan. Just wouldn't see it anywhere else.
In New York, it would be much more mannered. It would be more try hard. You know, if you could, I can see something like this through, say, a Marc Jacobs filter, but there would be so much more kind of serious thought rather than joy. That's what we've seen there.
Well, I think that's been the takeaway from all three collections. It just looks like they had so much fun making it. And, you know, it looks like they looked around them, what they were doing, and kind of had this, this excitement, which is something that's, I think it's easy to take for granted that they should be doing that, but if you think when you're that age, you're working in a very competitive, very fast-moving industry, and to see someone still manage to have a lot of fun with their clothes it's nice to see, and I think that's easy to take for granted in London, where you've got things like Vauxhall Fashion Scout, New Gen, Fashionista, because without those institutions, young designers just couldn't do this, and they are kind of the unsung heroes of London. I know they get a lot of press, but I don't think it's anywhere near enough.
But it's interesting also, you do get some designers that still manage to keep that sense of fun after 20 years, and in other fashion capital, you're talking about the Armanis, whatever, it tends to be over time, it does become more and more serious. Whereas you look at Anthony Allison yesterday, it's still the most fun collection. It's tongue-in-cheek, it's, they're just having a good time. And they've been in business 25 years.
And with enormous integrity.
Absolutely,
So which has been your favourite? If you can pick one, I know that's maybe cruel to ask.
I think that is cruel to ask. There's no way. I mean, if you'd asked us that question when we were looking at Claire Barrow at the beginning, I think that was original and exciting and controversial, and I'm sure we all like a drink. She would have been my pick then, and then as we've seen at the others,
but you can see
my opinion has swayed. So I
definitely a future for all of them. Without question, actually. Definitely.
What are we most excited about sort of going on with London? Are there other designers who you're looking at? Any Fashionista alumni that you're going to be watching out for?
Well, I'm also looking forward to J.W. Anderson, because I think talking about collaborations and working with other, obviously the collection for Topshop and so on, I think he's very interesting to watch at the moment, and the fact that he's still juggling the sort of women's wear, men's wear as well, and he's working very hard.
I'm looking forward to Philip Tracy now. That's a wonderful success story, isn't it? Someone who has always kept his integrity, who is an immaculate craftsman. For whatever we're going to see tomorrow night, and it will be glamorous, we're sure of that, and it will be glitzy and it will be gorgeous, but there is someone who with his hands makes these creations that are worn all over the world by everyone from, the idea that one person can seem right for Lady Gaga and the Queen of Thailand.
That epitomises what British designers can do as well, doesn't it?
If you look at someone like Kate Middleton wearing Alexander McQueen, I think that's kind of what every London designer should aspire to. They can have their clothes worn by their friends around the East End, but then they can also have...
So now we want to see Kate Middleton wearing the Tesco's outfit.
We do.
Or
the painted leather jacket, I think, actually. That would be a good one.
Yeah, and there's such a diversity and new things coming through, and talk about things coming through. We've been working with some of the graduates that are just starting out and deciding whether to start their own businesses. And yes, my one to watch is Casey Gann, who is one of our graduates from last year, whose collection she's just starting out. So watch this space.
Should we give them a round of applause to close things off then?
Definitely.
No? Thank you very much.